What really matters to you? What do you actually want to spend your time thinking about and doing? I think finding those things and holding on to them and nurturing them is so key.
If we are to push forward, if we are to get something new and to really deal with some of the real inequalities in the world, it's not going to come from emerging technologies. It's going to come from a creative background, people that understand criticality, know how to answer questions, know how to ask the right questions in order to get new answers into the world.
In the creative industries, talent is often seen as the starting point, the thing that gets people excited about you, the passion that fuels your career. But in a landscape defined by shifting markets, by new tech, and by the rising cost of living, we really need to consider the skills needed beyond the craft. My name is Christoph Lindner, and I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of the Royal College of Art. And in today's episode, we're asking, what is more important to a successful creative career? Is it talent? Is it entrepreneurial mindset? Or maybe something else entirely? And when we talk about an entrepreneurial mindset, we're really talking about creative agency, the ability to see your work as part of a larger system, the ability to navigate risk, to build a very broad practical skill set to support your career. And to help us get into this topic, I'm joined by Professor Suka-Bill, who is the RCA's Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education and Student Success. Zay is an expert in inclusive pedagogy with over 25 years of leadership experience, and she is currently redesigning the institutional systems that bridge the gap between creative education and professional equity. We are also joined by Damien Roach, an artist, researcher, and PhD candidate at the RCA. Damien's work spans the experimental and the commercial, from sharing his work at the Tate Modern and South by Southwest Festival to design commissions for global brands like Disney and Caribou. Really excited, Zay and Damien, to have you with us. Thank you for joining me. And just to get us going in the conversation, we'd love to hear a little bit about your own paths through education and into your careers. How did you start and how did you keep going? Zay.
Well, thank you. And it's lovely to be part of this conversation. Creative education, I suppose, has always played a part in my life. I was a child who didn't particularly like reading, didn't particularly want to build things. I just really wanted to be able to capture memories and concepts, and thought it was really important that we always have that kind of documentary process within our lives. And I have books from when I was 5 of doodling and this is what my grandmother said or looked like. And I felt like it was really important, that art was really important before I even knew what art was. And that took me down a path of, an undergraduate in photographic arts, a master's in photography. But lately, I've been really thinking about just the systems that have brought us all here today, including education and universities, and how universities really do need to help students have confidence in their kind of art practice. And I think that's what art education gave to me, and that's what I really would like to give to other people.
Beautiful. And what about you, Damien?
I would echo what Zoe said about, I'm really happy to be here. It's a super interesting topic and so crucial to look at all of these issues at this particular moment in time. My path has been and continues to be quite an unpredictable one. I think one of the great things about being able to look back over, the past, say, 20 years is starting to understand how dynamic the world at large, but also the industries that we're all engaged in are. When I started studying, I did my MA in painting at the RCA. And when I did that, I made the website for the Students' Union in the end of my first year, I think. And with the money that I got from doing that, I bought my first laptop. So you have to think about the fact that, I'm first year MA, and that was when I first had a laptop, and I was always interested in, making digital work and so on, and did in whatever way I could. But it's just to think how different things are. From that point to now, I've been, consistently exhibiting and kind of continuing with my artistic practice. But I've also been teaching and working in design and creative direction and, sound and music as well. I think that the whole landscape has transformed so much in the sense that creatives and practitioners who do work across many different fields are so much more common than they were at the time. And it was something that was often, kind of spoken about with a bit of alarm and concern from those around me, including tutors, to be fair, at the idea of, having this kind of multi-hyphenate mode of existing within the field, because it was often, in general, viewed with a little bit of suspicion. What is it that you are? What do you want to actually do? And if you are working across many different fields, this idea that possibly you're not taking any of them seriously or something. But I've always just been very interested in so many different things and tried to find as many different ways as I could to explore and produce and find out and communicate. So through just the chance of the way that things have changed in the world and so on, having that diversity to my skill set and experience and interests has ended up being a really valuable tool in navigating the present and future that is so unpredictable, and that no one really knows what's coming next. So I think looking back, I feel that that's something I'm very keen to kind of share, this sense that trying to keep as many doors open, maybe the most important one being, the door of your mind and your imagination.
Many of our listeners are going to be tuning into this episode because they are either contemplating a creative career or maybe at a stage in their creative career where they're wanting to figure out how to take the next step. So they're going to be looking to us in this conversation to come up with tips and ideas that can support and help them. But we're already getting some great ideas here. And two things I want to pick up on, which something you said, Zay, and then something you said, Damien. Zay, you mentioned being interested in art before you even knew what it was. And that made me think about how delicate those moments can be where, I wonder how many people have just an early interest in creativity and that creativity gets kind of closed down or discouraged, or you don't get the confidence or the support or the pathway, whatever it is you need to keep exploring and developing it. And Damien, you mentioned, you described yourself as partly a multi-hyphenated practitioner, and you became a multi-hyphenated practitioner before that was particularly common. But I kind of wonder in today's world, is there any other way to be? Is it really possible to not be multi-hyphenated in some way? But you also mentioned the unpredictable nature of your path. And I think that's something that resonates probably with most people's careers in any profession, but especially the creative industries, is that you cannot predict where the next opportunity is. And how do you remain optimistic and open about the possibilities when you don't know what comes next? So Zay, could you maybe share a bit on what you think helps nurture creativity in young people and sustain it through to university?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think thinking about some of the things that you said, Damien, I think the thing that is a thread probably through both our experiences is that initial interest. And an interest not necessarily in the work that you can produce, but actually the meaning of what your work is. And so I think about those days where I would spend just days trying to capture in a very visual way what life was like in a North London council estate. You know, that was my interest. It was interesting to me and quite unique. And I think there's something about having an openness and having a environment that allows you to do that. I didn't come from an academic family, so they just thought it was quite quirky, that I always had like a notebook, and I was always, you know, and it was their fault. They gave me a camera when I was 5, and so, you know, and all my money was spent on taking pictures and developing them at Boots. And I think for our listeners, there's something that they have to cling on to, which is that inner desire of interest, that this is important, and that shouldn't be swayed by a lot of the arguments that we hear about art. That is art important? Because we know that it can be, and that interest can have a social impact, a cultural impact, an economic impact. For me, it helped me socially to get into spaces that I never thought that I would be into. And I think for anybody who's considering art, amongst the noise of, you know, is it valuable to study art, and will I get a job, and all these real tensions and questions, I think what's really important is those quiet moments of interest, those quiet moments of like, this is important, not just to me, but it's important, it will be important to other people. And I think that spurs what you do, what you decide to do, and brings that out into the world.
I think there's a lot to be said for really seeking and pursuing those kind of honest elements of the self. You know, what really matters to you? What do you actually want to spend your time thinking about and doing? I think, you know, finding those things and holding on to them and nurturing them is so key, because once you do, those interests that are just so deeply a part of you will resonate and support a kind of dynamism and energy to what it is that you're doing that is very hard to disrupt. And it's easy to kind of get distracted by the audience, in a sense, you know, by what is it that everyone's doing and what's interesting and what people are talking about. But again, going back to this idea of, you know, the dynamism of society, of, you know, every industry, particularly at the moment, you know, nobody knows what everyone's going to be thinking about, you know, next week, next year, you know, in 5 years. And so if you're responding solely to, you know, what's happening right now and what people are making and what people are talking about, you're always behind, because that's already happened. So I think there's a lot to be said for kind of trusting that, you know, your voice, nurturing that, so then you can bring people into your world, you know, follow those instincts and hone them.
And I think maybe that's how I probably define an entrepreneurial mindset. So I think a lot of times we think of an entrepreneur as someone who's like self-promoting and can get into rooms and, you know, it's about commerce. But actually that interest and that honesty is what I would define as being entrepreneurial, and link that to agency, that you have an agency to know that your interest matters and that you can bring work into the world that also matters. And if you can get paid for it, that's really great. But there has to be an honesty of what you think you can produce. I'd be really interested in knowing kind of how you see that interest in talent. So for me, I probably would say talent might get you into the door, but it won't keep you in a room unless you do have that passion and that interest. But we talk a lot about talented students, talented artists, talented designers. I think that needs to be problematized. You know, there are issues with the word talent, but it would be I'd be interested in knowing how you see those things kind of collectively as an artist. Like, would you call yourself a talented artist?
I agree with you fully that, you know, talent is in a sense an overrated attribute. because what I see and what I've experienced as being maybe even more important, and a quality that you can make a decision to develop oneself, is resilience. So there'll always be ups and downs, moments when there's a lot happening and a lot of interest, and other moments when it's a bit quieter, and times when you feel very sure about what needs to be done, and other times when you don't. And I think trying to be as resilient as you can, and patient and focused, is just so important. So yes, it's great to be if someone has a lot of talent, that's really excellent, of course. But in the end, that quality of just that ability to just kind of keep going in the face of adversity and the times when things aren't really working out is really key. Another thing I'd like to say is I think there's obviously a lot that one might seek in the outside world, so opportunities, jobs, exhibitions, or whatever it might be, placements. And that's all really important and really great. But I think waiting for the world to open up for you is also maybe, a kind of red herring. It doesn't matter what particular industry you're working in. I think trying to make your world, make things happen, however that might look. So making things happen could be giving that person a call who you haven't seen for a while and having a coffee and talking about your ideas. It could be going to an exhibition or going to an event or reading the book, taking the trip, setting up some kind of project yourself, or making something that nobody's asked for, but just out of your own interest, really building that world and not waiting for permission to do things and to exist, and take up a bit of space in out there in the big old world. I think that's really, really important, because it's really easy to kind of think that access and permission is something that comes externally, when in fact you have agency, as you said, say earlier. So I think this is another thing as well, trying to sort of take the initiative about just doing things and making stuff happen. Given that we are speaking about entrepreneurship, I do think it's important to, try and be aware of ways in which, you can use your skills in ways that can help you pay your rent. Sometimes it's not always obvious where that can happen, but we've been speaking a lot about these problem-solving skills and ideation and things like that. I know personally I have always sustained some kind of teaching practice throughout, since finishing my studies. So the way that started, in a very practical way, I remember reaching out to places I had studied before and just saying, seeing if they wanted someone to come in and do a talk, or do some one-to-one tutorials or whatever. And you go and you build up your experience, and you make connections there. And again, it's the same thing we're saying about not waiting for the world to kind of open up for you. Some of those doors you have to. It's an interesting thing, sometimes there are doors that you don't realize are there. So part of, knocking on a door is realizing that door is even there. So I think really trying to sort of look at, with an open mind at your skill set and thinking, well, okay, where can that be valuable? And, not every single thing you do is going to be, even like the dream job, or you might find yourself doing things that you didn't even think of that are actually really interesting and really good, So I think, trying to take initiative in forging those kind of paths for yourself is really, really important. And I think there are maybe some people listening who hear the word, entrepreneurial and think, well, that's not me. I'm not, I'm not a business person. I don't want to think that way. But again, what both Christoph and Zay have said already, I think that thinking through that term in a wider way, where really what we're talking about is that sense of, doing and having a vision and seeing it through and being kind of taking responsibility really for your own development and the realization of your goals. It doesn't have to be purely about kind of commerce and business. It's about doing things and making a mark, having a vision, and again, to go back to that idea, building your world.
Yeah, I mean, that's really helpful because what we're not describing here is the hyphenated construction of, say, the artist stockbroker. Although that's fine. If that's your art and your practice, put those two things together. But what we're really saying is that in creative fields, that practitioners and students are developing skills that really help them navigate a world that is in constant change. So being resilient, the ability to survive and thrive under conditions of risk and precarity. Sadly, that's something that creative practitioners have needed for millennia, right? But also, what other skills do we learn in creative disciplines that allow us to have a presence and agency and find joy and make a difference in the world? And I would suggest there are quite a few, but I'm curious which ones you think, or which ones come to mind for you.
Flexibility, dynamism, open-mindedness, creative thinking. These are things that, they never go out of date or out of style. Doesn't matter what software you're using, what room you're standing in, those skills will serve you well.
Absolutely. And I like to hope, I don't know if I'm right, we'll find out soon, but I like to hope that in the age of AI, what we do in creative fields will actually grow in value and urgency, because where do new ideas come from? Where does innovation, new approaches, difference in whatever form come from? And the ability to think creatively, but also critically, and then express that in some form of making, whatever form that takes. I feel like the world is going to need more and more of that. And many fields that have not traditionally recruited from creative disciplines might well want to start thinking about recruiting from us, because we can offer things that will be really, really valuable to organizations, communities, governments, businesses, etc., as we navigate a world where what is easy to replicate will just get replicated. And so I think the value of creativity in that world is going to become much higher in the future.
Yeah, I completely agree, because I'm in many conversations where, AI and emerging technology is like at the top of the list. And the conversation very quickly becomes based in a fear of, AI is going to take our jobs, and some real kind of ethical questions about AI as well. And I think on top of that conversation, there is a real value in somebody who has studied a creative subject, which, like you said, brings them above just what can be replicated, but be a real problem solver in terms of, I think at the heart of what I see from students, at the heart of every student that I've ever taught, and I've taught thousands, not to give away my age, is a real curiosity in the world. And I think that's something that emerging technology just cannot give us, that curiosity of like, well, why and what's next? All it can give us is a scraping of what's already been done. And that's valuable, in certain industries. But if we are to push forward, if we are to get something new, to really deal with some of the real inequalities in the world, it's not going to come from, emerging technologies. It's going to come from a creative background, people that understand criticality, know how to answer questions, know how to ask the right questions in order to get new answers into the world. And I think that's of great value.
Another really important part of educational experience and experience out in the world and the kinds of things we're talking about, the creative industries, is other people. Embracing what you can learn from just hearing about other people's experiences, engaging in their way of seeing things, trying to, understand and embrace different ways of thinking and doing and knowing. I think that the communities that, you kind of, the communities that I've been lucky enough to become a part of throughout all of those different workplaces and educational experiences has been so valuable, because these people are also the industry in some sense. I think going back to one of the points earlier about not waiting for the world to kind of open up to you, it can be quite easy, I think, particularly, in sort of masters and so on, to think about the companies or the curators or the artists who are kind of out there and already, doing really well or very visible. But it's easy to forget actually that, the people that are around you when you're studying, they are your industry. You're all, studying at the same time, and you're going to be going out into the world and doing your things and setting stuff up. So I think it's very easy to kind of be looking out into the horizon when actually you're surrounded by, your network, your people, your peers. So keeping sight of that throughout study, but then also, out in the world after.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've observed that quite a few times at the RCA. And I remember we had a reunion, a 50-year reunion for the Art Bar at the RCA, which is this legendary space right at the core of the college that has hosted so many amazing musicians playing live over many, many decades, including The Clash and Roxy Music. And apparently, I think the Rolling Stones at one point hung out. I'm not sure if they played, but they hung out there. But anyway, I was talking to these alumni from the early 1970s who all studied together, and they still get together once a year and go on holiday. And they said exactly what you said, Damien, that they didn't realize it at the time, but they were each other's network. And as their careers grew, and they each went in different directions, someone went into curating, someone became a practicing visual artist, another person became a graphic designer, and I think a fourth one was doing filmmaking. But they were a resource to each other, and they helped each other navigate, but also helped each other open doors. And there was something about the camaraderie of that really just made me feel really good. Like, no one has to be alone. And I think that's one of the values of studying, is that you join a community, and hopefully that community in some form will be there with you and for you as you go through your career.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important part of education. And I think for me, there's something about really acknowledging that more people should have access to that, that we are three very highly educated people who sitting in the room of, talking about this, but it's such an uneven, creative industry is really uneven. There's so many inequalities, and so I'm thinking about those networks and being able to have an institution like the RCA really level some of those playing fields for people, so that it's not just a place where we can celebrate talent, which we have lots of, but it's a place where people can really find those connections, that the gaps that we all know in inequality can be lessened, where you can find, your tribe, your people.
Yeah, and let me bring into the conversation something we were talking about casually before we pushed the record button, which was the word failure. So that's a very heavy word. It's a big word. It's an F word, literally. And what I thought was so interesting in our discussion was, Damien, you brought it up, and you said something about the kind of positivity, the value, the joy of failure, and how you might play with it. Do you want to bring that in?
Yeah, I think that making mistakes and failing is an incredibly scary thing, and it's very tempting to try hard to not fail and to not put yourself in situations where things could go wrong. But in fact, it turns out that failing is really, really useful, because you kind of, you get knocked down and you get back up, you survive it, and you realize that there's nothing to be afraid of. You survive and you move on. And inside of failure is always learning. If you're truly putting yourself in a situation where something unpredictable and new and exciting can happen, there's always the danger of things going wrong. So if you aren't putting yourself in those zones of practice where you feel a little bit uneasy, a bit uncertain, a bit out of your depth, then maybe you're not quite doing it right. So I think running towards that possibility of things going wrong is such an important, thing to do, 100%.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. There's something really nice in terms of being able to experiment, right? Because then you kind of hone your voice, you know how to position yourself, you know how to speak about your work, you are able to articulate that inherent interest that we talked about at the beginning of this episode. But I also think that perhaps the definition of failure needs to be unpacked a little bit. I think about my own art school journey. I remember that first year, I thought feedback was failure. Like, if you didn't say it was like the best thing that you'd ever seen, I crumpled into this little ball of like, what does this mean? Why is there so much critique about my work? And so I think there is something about how we actually even think about failure and how students think about failure that needs to probably be so much more articulated in our pedagogy and what we do, because feedback, now I'm like, feedback's wonderful. Please give me some feedback. I want this to be the best that it could be. I want to be able to, really think about and develop work and ideas that stand the test of time, right? And it goes back to that resilience. But yeah, it did make me think, what do students think about failure? Because I definitely am just like, success to me was I got into a crit, no one said anything, and I got out. But how unvaluable was that for my practice? But it was the thing that I stretched for, and it goes back to how we define success as well. And I think our students are on this journey with us in a world that we've all said is changing. And part of what's really special about that studio culture is that safety. And I think if we're able to allow students to feel safe in their failure and safe in experimenting, then it's so much better outside in the world where real critique comes, real rejection comes, which also sometimes feels like failure, but is just a stepping stone of what, where you can get to.
So this is quite philosophical, but let's get a bit more pragmatic. And let me just push back on some of these ideas a little bit, just to see what you think.
Yeah.
So what I love here is this idea we should reclaim the concept of failure, the experience of failure. I love the idea that our pedagogy should teach failure,
yeah,
and help us understand its productivity and so on. A couple of weeks ago, we had a festival of AI, week-long festival at the RCA, exploring all aspects of AI. And it just makes me think maybe we should have a festival of failure, bring it all together across the RCA and show it. And then it makes me think of the final show that many art and design schools have, right? At the very end of the year, students picking the strongest, best, most superlative work, and that's what you exhibit to the world. But what would happen if we said, here's the worst thing I made all year. What do you think? And what can we learn from that? But universities are a very special place where we really do consciously try to create the spaces and the support for people to experiment with failure. Once you graduate and you're building a career, the stakes go up radically. And so how would you advise young creative professionals who want to take more risk, who want to be in that zone of discomfort that you described, Damien, who value feedback and value the experience you gain from failure, but cannot afford next month's rent, don't know where the next job is coming from? may not even know what country they're going to be living in 2 months' time. How do you approach that?
I think for me, I kind of love the idea of a festival of failure. I don't know if it will go down well, but one of the things I love about our shows here is not the final outcome, which I know is the thing that we display. But what I love here is being able to talk to students about the process of how they got to that final outcome. And I think for me, it's less about success or failure, but being able to articulate how you got somewhere. And I think that's as valuable in the industry and in your career. And I totally get the economic stakes and the high value, been there, where's my rent coming from? Shall I eat baked beans or shall I, are we going to have another jacket potato today? So I totally get that. But I think there is something about process that has to be celebrated, and maybe not a show of failure, but a show of process that got you to wherever you were thinking about, I think would be really valuable. And I, as somebody who worked in industry for a short amount of time, I think that's what helped me to be successful, because I was able to bring an articulation of how I got to the end product. You may have hated the end product, but you always understood the research. It was always grounded. There was always a way of being able to articulate it. And I think even in these really tight spaces that our students are trying to fit into, there is always a conversation and a value in getting them to articulate that curiosity, the research, the criticality that led to decision making, that led to the final outcome.
Yeah, it's such an interesting idea. I say that in terms of creative practice, that the most dangerous path is the one that appears to be the safest, because you can't afford to play it safe. It's very counterintuitive. But if you play it safe, then essentially what you're doing is you're making yourself more like everything else that's out there. And there are millions of, talented people who are as culturally aware as you and can identify, the current trends and mimic them, or, do what they can to fit in. But your greatest kind of asset is what's different. And it might be scary, and not everyone will necessarily like it. But if it's yours, and that's the thing, that in the right environment, which does exist, and there's someone and something where that's home and where that will be embraced, then you're the only person who has those qualities or has those interests or those skills. So embracing difference and innovation and really following your instincts. That, of course, though, just to ground that slightly, isn't easy. It's not about not working. It's not about not being self-critical and not listening to the criticism of others, not trying to push and develop and hone those things. It's not like the easy routes. But I think it's the path that will actually end up bringing more opportunity, open more doors, and be more fulfilling ultimately as well. So I think that's an important thing to keep in the at the front of the mind, really.
And I think that's what we want for our students. And when you were talking, there's a real sense of professional confidence and an identity. And I don't mean confidence. Confidence can be performed, but I mean confidence in like a clarity. And I think that's something that is really important and is needed across sectors, is like a real clarity in, what questions drive you, what context your work belongs in, and you being able to articulate that. And I think people who hire other people are drawn to that clarity. You want someone to be able to come into your organisation and be really clear about what they can bring and what they can produce. And a huge part of that professional identity is about confidence and resilience and an agency and a couple of other things that we talked about today.
And before we wrap up, I've been thinking of something throughout the conversation, because we keep talking about creative careers. And when I think of that, it always reminds me of the moment of graduation, convocation we call it here. And, every university has their own version of it, but we get to look out over thousands of graduating students and their families and their friends at the moment when they transition from being a student to a graduate. And there's a convention in that moment where whoever's speaking, will give some kind of advice. Remember this, remember that. I remember last year, Nick Cave, the musician, received an honorary doctorate, and he spoke to the students and he said, to remember that artists are the guardians of the soul of the world. And that really stuck with him. Very powerful advice, very powerful idea. But imagine you're up there giving that speech. You have a chance to say something to those students. And it doesn't have to be dramatic, it doesn't have to be big, but it has to be honest. What would you tell them?
I'm tempted to just go with Nick Cave. I think I would ask them to remember their experience, to remember each other when they're in rooms where opportunities are presented. I know that's how I got my start in the industry. It was not necessarily being in those rooms, but being graduates, people who had worked alongside me, seen my work, and then had someone say, "Oh, can someone do this?" And they mentioned my name, and that's how I got my first commission. So it would be simply just to remember the time that you spent here, remember each other, and to hold on to that experience as you go forward.
Maybe what I would do is, acknowledge the task that I was up there to say something inspiring or useful, and just hold the microphone out to the audience and just get them to say, just say a word or something that is meaningful to them. And essentially, with the extension of the microphone towards the audience is a kind of, metaphorical and actual passing of the baton. And I think that in that moment, maybe the most important thing to be delivered is that sense that it's now their time to speak and to feel confident to speak and to be heard. So I think that might be what I do.
Damien, those are beautiful thoughts on which to wrap up our conversation. And Zay and Damien, I want to thank you both for all that you've shared, as well as some of your really insightful tips for people wanting to create or build a creative career. And I think there's a lot in this conversation for us to take away and reflect on. And I particularly valued the way in both of your comments throughout our time together, something I heard was the importance of being generous, to each other and to others. And I think that's a really important thing to hang on to. I also heard a lot of really inspiring words about how a creative education gives you and allows you to take into your career some really important qualities, such as confidence, optimism, openness, resilience, agency. You talked passionately about the importance of embracing change and also authentically, for real, valuing difference. And also what comes if we reframe failure as something else, maybe as experience or as success or as feedback, but the importance of reframing failure. And something I also heard, which I don't know if you would agree with, is that ultimately a big part of a creative career is learning how to be yourself, which sounds like a cliche, but actually is at the kind of center of a lot of what we've talked about. And what I loved about your comments was being yourself is not just important for you, it actually matters, and it matters to others. So thank you so much. And I hope that lots of people who are listening gain a bit more confidence or the excitement to launch into their creative careers. And I want to thank our listeners. And if you'd like to hear more from us, please do like the episode or subscribe to the podcast.
This podcast is from the Royal College of Art, home to the next generation of artists, innovators and entrepreneurs, and the world's #1 art and design university. You can learn more about our programmes at rca.ac.uk, as well as finding news and events relating to the college and our application portal if you're interested in studying at the RCA.